The first time I saw him, he was being escorted through the grand corridor of the Sarathi Imperial Palace by 6 of our most heavily armed sentinels, and he was asking them about the ceiling. Not nervously, not to fill the silence. He was genuinely curious about the ceiling. He tilted his head back as he walked, studying the carved spiral patterns that our ancestors had chiseled into the bone-white stone over 4,000 years ago. And he said, in perfectly spoken Sarathi, "These spirals, they follow a mathematical sequence, don't they? Mix bands by exactly 1.6 times the last. I've only ever seen that pattern in nautilus shells back home." One of the sentinels, a decorated warrior named Caden, who had served my father for 30 years, and who had never once shown warmth to a foreign dignitary, looked up at the ceiling too, as if he had never seen it before, as if a human had just taught him something about his own home. That was the moment I should have understood what we were dealing with. I did not. My name is Vaelaan, daughter of Emperor Sorath of the Sarathi Dominion, heir to the 3 rings of governance, and at the time of the human delegation's arrival, I was 27 years old by our calendar, and deeply unimpressed by diplomats. I had sat through 49 official delegations in my life, 49 groups of carefully dressed, carefully worded foreign representatives who smiled too wide and bowed too low and said precisely nothing in the most elaborate possible language. Diplomats were, in my experience, the galaxy's most sophisticated liars. So when the human named Harrow entered the formal reception hall and bowed, not deeply, not shallowly, but exactly the correct depth for greeting an imperial heir according to Sarathi custom, which took our own courtiers years to master, I was already composing my polite expressions of disinterest. He straightened and looked at me. His eyes were a very ordinary human brown, nothing remarkable. No bioluminescence, no compound structure, no visible emotion membrane like our own species. Just 2 brown eyes and a pale, lightly lined face. He was not young. Somewhere in the middle of a human lifespan, I guessed. His hair was the color of dry sand, going silver at the temples. He wore a simple dark suit with a single small pin on the lapel, the Earth Diplomatic Corps insignia, a blue circle with a white figure reaching upward. He said, "Your Highness, thank you for granting this audience. I understand that Sarathi tradition holds the first meeting between delegations as a measure of character rather than policy, so I'll skip the policy." My father's chief advisor, Lord Davin, inhaled sharply. "You did not skip the formal recitation of intention. It was an insult of moderate magnitude." James Harrow seemed aware of this. He smiled, a small, easy expression that did not apologize, and continued. "I can have the formal recitation delivered in writing to Lord Davin's office by this evening, if that's more efficient. What I'd rather spend this time on, if your Highness permits, is a question. We've come a very long way, and I find that the question I'm most curious about is never the one that gets asked at first meetings." I sat forward slightly despite myself. Beside me, I felt my handmaiden Soren go very still. She would later tell me that she knew in that exact moment something unusual was happening. "Ask your question," I said. He asked, "What is the one thing about Sarathi culture that your historians are most proud of, that the rest of the galaxy has mostly gotten wrong?" The reception hall was silent. I could hear the ventilation currents in the ceiling. 22 courtiers, 6 guards, 4 advisors, and my father's second consort were all holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do with a question like that. From a man like this, in a room like this one, on a day when the fate of a potential interstellar treaty hung in the air like smoke. I answered him honestly. I told him about the reclaiming, about how every account in galactic records described it as a military campaign, a conquest, and how it was actually something our historians called the Long Patience, 4 generations of Sarathi people who moved into disputed territory, not with warships, but with seeds, with builders, with teachers, and simply outlasted the opposing claim by making the land undeniably, irrevocably theirs through presence and care. He listened without interrupting. That was the second thing I noticed about him. He listened the way most beings look, actively, with his full attention, his eyes on my face, his body still. When I finished, he said, "That's one of the most strategically sophisticated things I've ever heard. Your ancestors understood something that most military minds never figure out. Territory belongs to whoever cares about it most consistently. I did not know what to say. No foreign diplomat had ever responded to a piece of our history with that particular combination of strategic respect and genuine appreciation. They usually nodded and redirected to trade routes. Lord Davin cleared his throat and began steering the conversation toward the formal agenda. I let him, but I watched James Harrow for the rest of that session, and I noticed things. He noticed things too. He noticed which advisors deferred to which other advisors before speaking. He noticed that my father's second consort, Lady Veery, positioned herself slightly behind Lord Davin in a way that suggested she outranked him in practice if not in title. He noticed that the ceremonial refreshments had been placed within easy reach of our side of the table but not his, which was a subtle discourtesy, and rather than pointing it out, he simply didn't touch any refreshment for the entire 3-hour session. Not because he was offended, I would learn later, but because he didn't want to put a junior attendant in the position of having made an error in front of the delegation. I know this because I asked the attendant afterward. She told me the human had caught her eye at one point and given her the smallest possible nod, the kind that says, "I see it. It doesn't matter. You're fine." She had been terrified of the consequences. He had taken that terror away with a single nod, without drawing any attention to it, without making it a moment. That was the third thing I noticed. The delegation was scheduled to stay for 5 days. They stayed for 11. Not because negotiations ran long, they proceeded with unusual efficiency actually, but because on the third day, James Harrow asked my father if he might have access to the Imperial Library's lower archives, specifically the pre-unification records, and my father, surprised enough to agree, found that the human spent every free hour of the next 8 days reading through documents that our own scholars visited perhaps once a generation. My father was suspicious. He assigned 2 intelligence observers to monitor what Harrow was reading. They reported back that he was reading, of all things, agricultural records, crop yield documentation from before the Sarathi unification, rainfall patterns, soil maps, nothing remotely useful for espionage, nothing that connected to any political leverage point they could identify. On the 9th day, Harrow came to my father with a small, hand-drawn map and a 3-page summary he had written by hand in our script, imperfect but entirely legible, explaining that based on the pre-unification agricultural records, there was a region in the northern province of Sarath Kalan where the soil composition matched patterns he recognized from a successful restoration project on Earth, and that if the Sarathi Dominion was interested, there was a particular method of land care developed by human farmers in the previous century that might recover the region's productivity within about 20 years. My father stared at the map for a long time. Then he said, "Why would you give us this?" Harrow said, "Because you showed me your library. When someone shows you something they're proud of, and you find something useful in it, you tell them." My father invited him to dinner that evening, the formal kind, with the whole family. Harrow arrived with a small gift for each person, nothing expensive, nothing that carried political weight, just small objects he had brought from Earth, that he thought each specific person might find interesting. He had been paying attention for 9 days. The gifts were perfect, not showy, just right. He brought me a small, flat stone with a fossil pressed into it, a creature from Earth's ancient oceans, a spiral shape. "Fits the ceiling pattern," he said quietly as he handed it to me. "Same mathematics." I held the stone and felt, for the first time, genuinely unsettled. Not in a bad way. In the way you feel when you realize a situation is more complex than you initially classified it. In the galaxy I had grown up in, there was a standard picture of humanity. Every civilization had one. Humans were young, as interstellar species went. Barely 400 years since first contact. Barely 200 since they'd been taken seriously. They were energetic, chaotic, surprisingly resilient, and this was the part that made more experienced civilizations nervous. Completely unpredictable. They had survived things that should have ended them 3 or 4 times over. They held a peculiar relationship with conflict. They were not the most physically capable species, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced by most measures. But they had this quality, this strange, stubborn refusal to accept any situation as final, that made them deeply uncomfortable to have as enemies. The Galactic Compact's assessment of humanity, which I had studied as part of my diplomatic education, used a phrase I had always found oddly poetic for a bureaucratic document. It said, Humans are a species that has made peace with uncertainty by becoming proficient at it. I thought I understood what that meant before Harrow arrived. I thought it was a complicated way of saying humans were adaptable and slightly reckless. After 9 days watching James Harrow move through our palace, reading our history, remembering every name, noticing every detail, diffusing every small tension before it became a large one, all while appearing to simply be a pleasant person on a diplomatic visit, I began to suspect the phrase meant something much larger. Proficient at uncertainty did not mean comfortable with chaos. It meant something more precise. It meant that humans had trained themselves, over millennia of difficult history, to operate at full capacity, in situations where every variable was unknown. While other species sought to reduce uncertainty before acting, humans had somehow learned to act well inside it. The uncertainty itself did not slow them down. The formal negotiations concluded successfully. A framework treaty was signed. The Sarathi Dominion and the human civilization, they called their political body the Earth Compact, agreed to a period of open cultural and scientific exchange, with trade terms to follow over the next 3 years. At the farewell gathering, Lord Devan made a speech. He said all the correct things in the correct order. Then Harrow spoke. He thanked us by name, every person in the room, every courtier, every attendant who had served the delegation during their stay. He had memorized 31 names in 11 days, and he used each one correctly, with the proper honorific, in the proper order of precedence. When he reached my name, he said, "And to Her Highness Vela An, who answered a strange question honestly on the first day, and made everything that followed possible. Thank you." My father looked at me. I kept my expression composed. But I put my hand in my pocket and felt the small fossil stone he had given me, the spiral, the mathematics of the ceiling, and I thought, I am going to need to recalibrate everything I think I know about this species. The delegation left. Their transport cleared our orbital station and engaged its drive, and the stars simply swallowed them. I went back to my duties. I filed my diplomatic observations in the standard format. I wrote, in the section labeled Nature of Delegation, that James Harrow was the most attentive and strategically aware diplomat I had encountered in my career, and that the Earth Compact should be considered a partner of significant long-term value. What I did not write, because I did not yet have the language for it, was the thing that had been sitting at the edge of my thoughts since he walked in and noticed the ceiling. There was something about the way he moved through a room that felt like someone who had already accounted for every exit, every variable, every possible way the next 5 minutes could unfold, and had decided, deliberately and fully, to spend those 5 minutes being kind, not because he had to be, not because he was unaware of the other options, but because he had looked at all the options and chosen that one. That is a very specific feeling to get from a person. I had never felt it before from anyone except my father, and my father was an emperor who had run a civilization for 40 years. 3 months later, James Harrow sent a follow-up communication to the Sarathi court regarding the agricultural land survey he had proposed. Attached to it was a short personal note addressed to me. It said, "The fossil you're holding comes from a creature that lived 380 million years ago. It didn't survive the extinction events it faced by being the biggest or the fastest. The researchers who study it believe it survived by being extraordinarily good at finding the right conditions and adapting before anyone else noticed the conditions were changing. I thought you might find that interesting. H." I read the note 4 times. Then I put it in the drawer, where I kept things I wanted to think about carefully before deciding what they meant. The drawer was almost empty at that point. It would not stay empty for long. 6 weeks after that note arrived, the Earth Compact formally requested a follow-up diplomatic meeting to advance the framework treaty into its second phase. The request named, as their primary representative, James Harrow. I found myself, to my considerable surprise, looking forward to it. I also found myself, and this was more troubling, spending a full evening in the Imperial Library's lower archives, reading the pre-unification agricultural records he had spent 8 days studying. I wanted to see what he had seen. I wanted to understand why those particular documents, in a library of 40,000 years of Sarathi history, had been the thing that caught his attention. I read until the building's environmental systems shifted to night cycle. I found the region he had mapped. I followed his reasoning, point by point, through the soil records and rainfall patterns, and crop histories. And at the end of it, I sat in the archive room in the low amber light of the night cycle, holding a 380-million-year-old fossil in one hand and a pre-unification soil map in the other, and I understood that James Harrow had walked into our library with no agenda, genuinely curious, and had found something valuable, buried in records we ourselves had forgotten to look at. That was when I first thought, I want to understand how this person's mind works. I did not yet understand that this thought, this completely ordinary, rational, academically motivated thought, was the beginning of the most significant decision of my life. I put the fossil in my pocket and went to bed. Tomorrow, there was a court session to attend. The day after that, a formal response to the Earth Compact's delegation request needed to be composed. I composed it myself, which was unusual. Lord Davin raised an eyebrow. I told him I wanted to ensure the language was precise. The response said that the Sarathi Dominion welcomed the continuation of discussions, that the terms of the second phase would require careful examination, and that we looked forward to productive engagement with the Earth Compact's representative. Then I added one line that Devon did not see before it was sent, because I wrote it after he left the room. It said, "Please also convey to Delegate Harrow that the region in Sarath Kalan has been referred to the Agricultural Ministry for preliminary assessment, and that the ceiling in the Grand Corridor was indeed designed using a recursive expansion sequence. Our chief architect confirms the ratio is 1.618. I was fairly certain that was the first personal communication an heir of the Sarathi throne had ever sent to a foreign diplomat that was, at its core, about mathematics and soil. I was also fairly certain I did not mind. He arrived for the second visit on a morning when the fog was so thick across the Sarathi capital that you could not see the far towers of the palace from the inner courtyard. I was standing on the upper observation deck when the transport came in through the low cloud, and for a moment, it was just a shape in white, a dark outline descending slowly, soundlessly, through something that looked solid enough to touch. My handmaiden Soren said, quietly, "It is a strange kind of entrance." "Most things about them are strange," I said, but I was already moving toward the stairs. The formal greeting was shorter this time. Both sides knew the protocol now. The bowing, the recitations, the ceremonial refreshments, all of it moved quickly, efficiently, like people who trusted each other enough to skip the performance. Lord Davin noted this afterward with something that might have been approval. He was not an easy man to impress, and he told me that the Earth Compact's delegation handled themselves with what he called the dignity of people who have nothing to prove. He meant it as high praise. Harrow and I met properly on the third day, in the smaller conference room that looked out over the palace gardens. The second phase trade discussions were already being handled by a team of specialists on both sides. My role, and his, was the broader conversation, the kind that actually determined whether the specialists' work would matter or be quietly shelved in a decade. He came in with a flat leather case and a cup of something hot. He set both on the table, looked at the garden outside the window for a moment, and said, "I've been thinking about your line in the response, about the ceiling ratio." "Have you?" I said. "I've been thinking about it because it made me realize something." He sat down. The architect who designed that corridor didn't just use the sequence. They used it, knowing someone else would eventually recognize it. That's a very particular kind of confidence. The confidence of people who build things expecting to be understood by whoever comes after. I sat across from him. We had a word for it. It translates roughly as forward trust. The idea that what you create will be met with enough intelligence on the other side to be received correctly. He looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize. A kind of focused attention, like a lens concentrating light. "That's an extraordinary cultural value," he said. "Humans have a version of it, but it's mostly in artistic traditions. We call it speaking to posterity. The idea that you build for people who don't exist yet. Is that different from forward trust? Maybe not. Maybe it's the same thing with different confidence levels." He smiled. "Your architects seemed certain the future would be smart enough. Ours always sounded a little more hopeful about it. We talked for 3 hours, not about trade, not about the formal matters in the leather case. We talked about architecture and mathematics, and the way civilizations preserve knowledge. And somewhere in the middle of it he asked about the reclaiming again. Not to be polite, but because he had clearly been thinking about it since my first answer, and had developed more questions. I answered them. All of them. By the end of it, I had told him more about Sarathi pre-unification history than I had told any foreign delegate in my career, and I could not entirely explain why, except that he asked questions that made me want to find the true answer, rather than the diplomatic one. On the 5th day, something happened that I did not expect. One of the junior members of the Earth Compact's delegation, a young man named Owen Kell, fell seriously ill. Not dangerously. A reaction to something in our local food, the medical team determined quickly. But he was unable to function for 2 days, and was confined to the delegation's guest quarters. The correct protocol was for the delegation to note his absence at formal sessions and continue. Foreign medical incidents were managed by the hosting staff. The delegates' team would be kept informed of his progress. Harrow did not follow this protocol. On the evening of Owen Kell's first sick day, Harrow went to the guest quarters himself, sat with the young man for 2 hours, and apparently spent most of that time talking about nothing consequential. Owen's family, his home city, a sport he played badly and loved anyway. The palace attendant who brought their evening refreshments reported this to me because she found it unusual and did not know if it was something to be concerned about. I told her it was not. Then I sat with that information for a while. In Sarathi culture, a superior who sat with an ill subordinate was not remarkable. It was expected, in certain family structures and certain types of units. But in formal diplomatic settings, across civilizations, the custom was almost universal. You maintain the function of the delegation. You do not disrupt the schedule of a mission over a junior member's routine illness. You send appropriate concern through appropriate channels. Harrow had decided that Owen Kell, who was 23 years old and sick and far from home, needed someone to talk to more than the delegation needed him at dinner. I mentioned this observation to my father during our evening briefing. He listened, stirred his tea once, and said, "The humans have a reputation for this. Their loyalty structures are unusual. They form intense local attachments to individuals, not just to hierarchies."
Is that a weakness?
I asked. My father was quiet for a moment. "It depends entirely on how it interacts with their competence," he said finally. "In an incompetent person, deep personal loyalty is a liability. It clouds judgment. In a very competent person..." He trailed off and looked at his tea. "What?" I asked. "In a very competent person," he said slowly, "it becomes the engine of everything they do. The judgment stays clear. The loyalty provides the fuel." He looked up at me. He had a look I recognized, the one he used when he was telling me something he wanted me to hold on to. "Watch him," my father said, "not what he says. How he decides." The second phase discussions concluded at the end of the 3rd week. The framework advanced. Trade terms were set. An exchange program was established. Sarathi scholars to Earth institutions, human researchers to our academic centers. It was, by any objective measure, a significant diplomatic success for both sides. On the last formal evening, there was a dinner. Not the elaborate ceremonial kind, but the smaller, more genuine kind that happened when people had actually spent 3 weeks working together and wanted to acknowledge it. My father attended. So did several members of the High Council, and Harrow's full team, including Owen Kell, recovered and bright-eyed and clearly very happy to be out of his room. Near the end of the evening, my father rose to speak. He said the standard things about cooperation and the future of both civilizations, and then he said something that was not standard at all. He said, "In 40 years of diplomatic engagement with the species of this galaxy, I have twice felt that I was speaking not just with a representative of a civilization, but with a person who genuinely understood mine. Delegate Harrow is the second time." The room was quiet. That kind of statement from an emperor was not common. It was not formal praise. It was personal assessment, which carries different weight. Harrow stood and said simply, "That means more than you know, Your Majesty." Later, as the dinner was breaking apart and people were moving toward the exits in small clusters, Harrow found me standing near the window that looked out over the illuminated gardens. He stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Can I tell you something that's not diplomatic?" "You're asking permission to be informal," I said. "I'm asking because I don't want to presume." I looked at him sideways. "Tell me," he said. "The first time I came here, I was briefed extensively on the Sarathi court. Cultural norms, political structure, key relationships, historical sensitivities. The briefing was thorough. I've been in this work long enough to know that the difference between a good briefing and the real thing is usually somewhere between significant and enormous. He paused. This gap was the largest I've ever encountered, in the best possible way. Everything the briefing said was accurate, but nothing it said captured this. He gestured, vaguely but somehow specifically, at the garden, the palace, the room behind us, the entire civilization they represented. What was missing? I asked. He thought about it carefully. That was another thing about him. He treated questions as things that deserved real answers, not quick ones. The briefing said the Sarathi were a civilization with a deep sense of long-term responsibility. It gave me the political and historical evidence for that. What it couldn't tell me was that you'd feel it walking through your front door. The ceiling, the library, the pre-unification records nobody thought to look at in 3 generations. All of it is a civilization that keeps doing the work of caring for itself, even when nobody's watching. That's not in any briefing document. That's a thing you can only know by being here. I looked at him for a long moment. The garden lights were reflected in his eyes, small points of gold and white. I said, "Your civilization has an interesting reputation." "I know," he said, without defensiveness. "Most of what we're told about humans involves resilience, survivability, the capacity to endure and adapt. The briefings our court receives tend to emphasize," I chose the word carefully, "endurance." "That's accurate," he said. "But that's not what I see when I look at you," I said. He waited. "I see someone who spends enormous energy on things that have nothing to do with endurance. You sit with a sick junior colleague for 2 hours, talking about nothing. You spend 8 days in an archive reading soil records. You remember every name in a room of 31 people and use them correctly 11 days later." I paused. "That's not resilience. That's something else." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Resilience is what humans do when things go wrong. What you're describing is what humans do when things go right." He looked back at the garden. "We're not very good at just having what we have. We tend to always be building toward the next thing, bracing for the next problem. But every now and then someone figures out how to just be present, in the room, in the moment, with the actual people who are actually there." "Is that something you had to learn?" I asked. "Yes," he said simply. "It took a long time." I thought about that. I thought about how old he looked in the eyes, not in a tired way, but in the way of someone who has seen enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. He must have been through a significant amount of life to get to this particular version of himself. "Can I tell you something that is also not diplomatic?" I said. He turned to face me properly. "When I recommended to my father that the Earth Compact was worth serious engagement, I wrote that you were the most strategically aware diplomat I had encountered." I held his gaze. I was not wrong about that. But I was not entirely right either. I think I understand now what I was actually observing and didn't have the right word for. You are aware of everything. Not strategically. Just everything. The ceiling, the attendance mistake with the refreshments, Owen Kell's unhappiness, the soil records. You noticed all of it. And in each case you chose to do something with what you noticed. Not something advantageous, just something correct. He was very still. "That is an unusual quality," I said. "I have met a great many careful people. I have not met many people who are careful in every direction at once." He said, very quietly, "My grandmother used to say that attention is the truest form of respect, that whatever you pay attention to, you are saying has value." Your grandmother sounds like someone worth quoting. She was. He paused. She'd have liked this ceiling. I laughed. I genuinely laughed, and it surprised both of us slightly, and then we stood there smiling at the garden, and the evening felt like a different kind of thing than a diplomatic dinner. 3 weeks after the delegation left, I received a message. Not through official channels. Through a personal relay, addressed to me by name. It was short. It said, "The soil assessment team in Sarath Kalan found the site. First trials suggested in spring. Also, I believe I left a book in the archive reading room. It's a collection of Earth agricultural philosophy from the 22nd century. You're welcome to read it. I'll get it when I'm back." When I'm back. Not if. When. I read the message twice. I folded the fossil stone in my hand. I had started carrying it, I realized, some weeks ago, without consciously deciding to. The small spiral from a creature that survived because it understood changing conditions before anyone else noticed they were changing. I wrote back. I said, "The book has already been read. You'll want to discuss Chapter 7. Also, when are you back?" His response came in 4 hours. "I have another assignment in the Virath sector that will take 6 weeks. After that, I'm told there are third phase discussions to begin. I'll be back for those. Is 6 weeks too long to wait to talk about Chapter 7? I considered for a moment the correct diplomatic way to answer that question. There were several. All of them were technically accurate, and all of them left the truth hovering at the edge, politely unspoken, the way diplomats leave things. I did not write any of them. I wrote, 6 weeks is acceptable. Do not be longer than 6 weeks. Then I set down the message, picked up the small ancient fossil, looked at its perfect spiral, and thought about forward trust, about building things for people you haven't met yet, about what it meant to create something with the confidence that whoever came after would be intelligent enough to receive it correctly. I thought, the ancestors who designed that ceiling had no idea, 4,000 years ago, that a human would walk under it and immediately recognize the mathematics. They built it anyway. They trusted in the eventual arrival of someone who would understand. I put the fossil in my pocket and went to find Lord Devan to begin preparing the third phase documentation. 6 weeks was an acceptable wait, but I was all ready, I noticed, counting the days. He proposed to me in the archive room. Not that archive room. Not the one with the pre-unification records. The newer one, the one on the palace's eastern wing, where the diplomatic working files were stored. We had been sitting there for 2 hours reviewing the third phase documents, and I had just said something, I don't remember exactly what, something about the trade clause language, and he set down his pen, folded his hands, and said, "Vela, I would like to ask you something that has nothing to do with the documents in front of us." My first thought was that something had gone wrong on Earth, a political complication, a change of assignment. My second thought, following very quickly, was that his voice had a tone I had not heard from him before. Careful in a completely different way from diplomatic careful. This was personal careful. I set down my own pen. I waited. He said, "I have been coming here for 7 months. I have read about your civilization since I was assigned to this mission, which is now almost 14 months ago. In that time, I have learned things about the Sarathi Dominion that your own scholars sometimes seem to have forgotten. I have thought about this place, and about you specifically, more than I have thought about anything else in recent memory." He paused, very briefly. "That's not diplomatic behavior. That's something else." "Yes," I said carefully. "I am aware that what I'm about to ask is not conventional," he said. "The Sarathi tradition of political marriage exists, but it's been used for different purposes than the one I'm proposing. I'm not here on behalf of a policy. I'm here on behalf of myself." He met my eyes steadily. "I would like to ask if you would consider marrying me. Not for the treaty, not for the alliance, though I understand it would have implications for both. For the reason that I would very much like to spend my life in a position to keep having conversations with you about Chapter 7 of agricultural philosophy books and sealing mathematics, and things that nobody else seems to want to talk about." The archive room was very quiet. Outside, there was the distant sound of the palace's ventilation system, and somewhere further away, the echo of a door. I said, "You did not ask my father." "No," he said. "That is an enormous breach of Sarathi protocol." "I know. I thought about it for 3 weeks." A pause. "I decided that asking your father before asking you would be choosing the correct form over the correct substance. The substance is that you are a person who should choose, not be chosen. Your father can be informed after, if you say yes. If you say no, your father doesn't need to know we had this conversation at all." I looked at him for a long time. He held the look without flinching, without performing confidence or casualness, just sitting there in the archive room in the working hours of an ordinary Tuesday, having asked the most unusual question I had been asked in my life. I thought about the ceiling. I thought about forward trust. I said, "That is the most precisely argued marriage proposal I have ever heard. Is that a yes?" He said, and there was something in his voice that was not diplomatic at all, just genuine and slightly vulnerable, in the way that even very careful people cannot help being when the thing they want is actually at risk. "I'll tell you in the morning," I said. After I've had time to think." He nodded. He picked up his pen and went back to the trade clause document, as though nothing had shifted in the room. I picked up my pen too. We worked for another hour. At some point he handed me a better formulation for the clause I had been struggling with, and I read it, improved it slightly, and handed it back, and neither of us mentioned anything else. I told him yes in the morning. In the same archive room, before anyone else arrived for the working session, I came in early, sat down in my usual chair, and when he came in I said, without preface, "Yes." He sat down. He was quiet for a moment, and there was something in his face that I had never seen on him before. Just open happiness, without any strategy behind it at all. "Good," he said. Then he said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me yet. You have to tell my father." He told my father that afternoon. I was not in the room for it, which was a deliberate choice. My father and I had discussed this beforehand, because once I had said yes, I had thought it necessary to warn him before Harrow arrived, so he wasn't blindsided. My father's reaction to being warned was a long silence, a single measured breath, and then, "Well, that is the most efficient breach of protocol I have encountered in my reign." I told him what Harrow had said, about choosing the correct substance over the correct form, about the idea that I should choose, not be chosen. My father looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one he saved for moments of important information. He said, "And do you? Choose him?" "Yes," I said. He was quiet again. Then he said, "He is from a civilization we do not fully understand." "I know. The advisors will make this very complicated." "I know that too. Lord Devon will need medical attention when he hears about it." I almost smiled. "Davin will adapt." My father looked at his hands. He had governed the Sarathi Dominion for 43 years. He had made 1,000 decisions that balanced the lives of billions of people against each other, and he had mostly gotten them right, because he was the kind of person who genuinely felt the weight of them. He looked up at me and said, "He noticed the soil records that our own people missed. He sat with a sick young man for 2 hours, because the young man needed company. He asked you before he asked me, because he thought it was more important to respect your agency than to follow correct form." A pause. "I do not fully understand his civilization, but I understand him well enough. Yes, Vela, I will receive him." The wedding was 4 months later. Sarathi weddings were long, elaborate, and deeply ceremonial. The Earth Compact sent a delegation of 112 people. Harrow's immediate family, his brother and sister-in-law, 2 nephews, his mother, and a woman he introduced as his oldest friend, named Claire, who had small gray eyes and a way of looking at everything as though she was storing it for later, stood in the first row of the human section during the ceremony. Afterward, Claire found me alone for approximately 90 seconds while the celebration was in its transition between its first and second phases. She said, "In Sarathi so accurate it made me blink. He spent 4 months before your first meeting, reading everything ever written about your civilization, in any language we had access to. He does that for every assignment, but I've been his friend for 22 years, and I've never seen him read anything 4 times. "What did he read 4 times? I asked. "The account of the reclaiming," she said, "specifically the part about the long patience." She looked at me with those gray eyes. "I thought you might want to know that." Then she slipped back into the crowd, and I stood there for a moment, with the understanding that Harrow had walked into our first meeting, having read our history so thoroughly, he noticed what even we had stopped noticing, and that he had gone back to one specific story 4 times before he ever set foot in our hall. The long patience. 4 generations of people who moved into disputed territory not with weapons but with seeds and care and time, and outlasted every other claim by simply being consistently, persistently, genuinely present. I folded that piece of information somewhere inside me and carried it forward. The first year of our marriage was not simple. Nothing worth having is simple. Politically, the union created exactly the complications my father had predicted. Other civilizations recalibrating their assumptions about both the Sarathi Dominion and the Earth Compact. Advisors on both sides managing the implications. A constant stream of commentary from every corner of the galaxy about what it meant and what it signaled, and what it would inevitably lead to. At home, in the private rooms, in the working hours, in the evenings, it was something different. He had, genuinely, and without apparent effort, learned enough about Sirathi domestic life to navigate it without causing friction. He had learned 9 of our languages by the end of the first year. He cooked, which was not a common skill among Sirathi nobility, and which he did with a focused, almost meditative attention to the process. I once found him spending an entire afternoon trying to replicate a traditional Sirathi dish from a recipe that was 400 years old and had 3 missing steps, and when I asked what he was doing, he said he was filling in the missing steps by reasoning backward from what the dish was supposed to taste like. He was right about all 3 missing steps. The dish was correct. He ate 2 bites, said it was excellent, and then immediately started adapting the recipe for a version that used ingredients more widely available in our current market. I watched this process and thought, this is how he does everything. He understands what something is supposed to be, reasons backward to figure out how to make it, and then adapts it without losing what made it what it was. He received foreign visitors at court with me, and I began to watch very carefully how he interacted with delegations from civilizations that had more complicated relationships with humanity. The Vareth Consortium sent a delegation in our 8th month that was openly unfriendly. Their lead diplomat, an experienced woman named Tassari, made several comments during the formal session that were technically within the bounds of courtesy, but were designed to establish a clear sense of hierarchy, the implication being that humanity was a young, minor, recently elevated species that was perhaps being given more credit than it had earned. Harrow listened to all of it. He did not show irritation. He did not bristle. He asked Tassari about the consortium's historical relationship with the region of space they were discussing, a question so specific and so informed that it stopped her mid-condescension. She answered. He asked a follow-up question. She answered that too. Within 30 minutes, they were having an entirely genuine conversation about the consortium's early exploration history, and she had forgotten entirely that she had come in with an agenda of subtle dismissal. Afterward, when we were alone, I said, "She was being deliberately rude to you." "I know," he said. "You completely redirected her without ever addressing it." "Addressing it would have made it the center of the conversation," he said. "It wasn't worth being the center of the conversation. Her actual knowledge of the regional history was interesting. That was worth the conversation's center." I sat with that for a moment. "Does it not bother you, being underestimated?" He thought about it. "It used to," he said. "When I was younger. Now I mostly find it useful." "Useful," I said. "People who underestimate you do not prepare for you correctly," he said simply. "There are worse positions to be in than the one where your opponent's strategy is built on a false assumption about your capabilities." I looked at him. He was reading something. He always had something to read, and he said this last thing so quietly and so without particular emphasis that it took a moment to register what he had actually said. I turned back to my own work, but I sat with his words for a long time. There are worse positions to be in than the one where your opponent's strategy is built on a false assumption about your capabilities. Not your opponent's underestimation of you, your opponent's strategy being built on it. Built on it, as in dependent on it, as in the underestimation is itself something that can be used. I had grown up in a court. I understood strategy. I had been taught diplomacy and governance since I was old enough to sit through a council session. I had read the histories of 100 different civilizations' approaches to conflict and resolution. What he had just said, in passing, while reading something, was the most efficient description of strategic misdirection I had ever heard, and he had said it with the tone of someone observing that it looked like rain. I said, without looking up from my own papers, "Your grandmother's advice about attention. Did she also give you advice about strategic positioning?" "She told me that the most dangerous thing in any conflict is a person who appears harmless," he said. He turned a page. She said it approvingly. She was a difficult woman to surprise. "Where is she now?" A pause. "She died 8 years ago, 94 years old. She was playing cards with her neighbors, and she won 4 hands in a row, and then quietly went to sleep, and didn't wake up." He smiled at whatever he was reading, but I understood it was partly at the memory. She would have said, it was exactly the correct way to end a game. I thought about a woman who could be described as the most dangerous thing in any conflict, and who also played cards with her neighbors at 94 and won. I thought about what kind of civilization produced people like that. People who could be, simultaneously, the sharpest possible mind in any room, and also just genuinely, warmly human in the next moment. I thought, I am still learning what I am married to. And I thought this not with alarm, but with the specific, quiet excitement of someone who has found a subject deep enough to spend a long time studying. Outside the window, the fog was coming in again over the Sarathi capital. The towers disappeared into white, one by one, and the lights of the city below looked like scattered stars. He turned another page. I went back to my papers. We sat there in the comfortable working quiet of people who had found the right conditions, and I thought of the fossil in my pocket, the spiral, the ancient creature that survived by recognizing change before anyone else. And I thought, I think I understand, now, why he brought me this particular stone. I think he was telling me something about himself. I was in a meeting with the Agricultural Ministry about the Sarath Kalan restoration project when the emergency alert reached Lord Davin's office. I know the precise time because the meeting notes record it, and I have looked at those notes many times since. It was the 14th hour and 23rd minute of the standard day, a Tuesday, 11 months after our marriage, and I was talking about soil composition when Divan's aide came to the door, with the specific expression that meant something had happened outside the scope of anything the aide had been trained to handle. The Cathari Empire's forward fleets had gone silent, not destroyed. The word that came back from every monitoring station on the border was not destroyed. It was silent. No distress signals. No debris fields. No energy discharge readings consistent with combat. No electromagnetic signature of any kind, consistent with warship systems going offline in a hostile engagement. Just silence where there had been, 11 minutes prior, 1,400 warships maintaining their standard patrol patterns. Within 30 minutes, the Sarathi Emergency Council had convened. Within 2 hours, every major civilization with monitoring capability in that region of space had issued alerts. The Galactic Compact's communication networks lit up with so much traffic that 3 relay stations experienced their first performance failures in recorded history. I sat through every emergency session. I read every report as it came in. I kept my face composed and my thinking organized, because that is what the situation required, and because composure in a crisis was something my father had spent 15 years specifically teaching me, and because, I will be honest, I had learned, in 11 months of watching Harrow, that a calm face is not the same as a calm mind, and that the calm face was worth maintaining, even when the calm mind was working very hard at something. He was at the council sessions. Of course he was. By this point he was, functionally, part of the Sarathi court structure, in a way that had developed organically over the months of our marriage. Not officially, no title, but the council knew him, trusted his perspective, and his presence at emergency sessions had been tacitly accepted because he was quiet, because he contributed when asked, and did not when not asked, and because on 3 separate occasions in the past year, he had noticed things in briefing reports that experienced Sarathi analysts had missed. He sat beside me through all of it. He drank tea. He listened. When the reports came in, he read them at the same pace as everyone else. But I noticed, because by now, I noticed things about him the way he noticed things about rooms, that his eyes stopped at certain lines and stayed there slightly longer than they stopped at others. I noticed which lines. Later, when everyone had dispersed, and the session had ended with the conclusion that there was no conclusion yet, no explanation, no recoverable evidence, I went back to the briefing documents and found the lines he had paused on. They were not the dramatic lines, not the summary statements about the scale of the disappearance or the strategic implications for the border region. They were small, specific technical details buried in sensor readings. The detection logs from the nearest monitoring station showing the exact pattern of the fleet's last known movements, the spacing between ships, the direction each vessel was oriented in the final recorded scan, the exact moment the silence began, not approximately, but to the second, for each ship, and the order in which each one went silent. I read those lines, and I thought about the pattern, and I could not make it mean anything. The data was there, but the pattern was beyond my training to interpret. Harrow had understood something in those lines. I was certain of it, the way you become certain of things when you know a person well enough to read what their attention is doing. He had understood something, and he had said nothing, and he had drunk his tea calmly, while 17 Sarathi counselors generated 146 theories, and he had been very still in the way he was sometimes still, when he had already finished a problem that others were still beginning. That evening I went to find him. He was in our private working rooms, sitting at the window that looked south over the city. He was not reading. He was just looking out. "Tell me what you saw in the sensor data," I said. He looked at me. A long moment. "Nothing I can prove," he said. "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "The ships went silent in order. Not simultaneously, not randomly, but in a specific sequence that corresponds to their communication hierarchy. The flagship first, then the command vessels, then the operational ships, then the escort vessels, and each one went silent, exactly 22 seconds after the previous one." I stared at him. "That's not a weapon pattern," I said. "No," he said. "A weapon creates chaos. It propagates based on physics, not on communication hierarchy." "Yes." I sat down. The implications arranged themselves in order. The ships were responding to something. Each tier of the command structure responding to the next tier's signal, in sequence, in 22-second intervals. That would be consistent with a communication that was relayed through command channels, he said. Something that each level of command received, processed and acted on, then passed down. "You're saying they received a message," I said. "I'm saying the pattern is consistent with that. And the message made them go silent, all 1,400 of them, tier by tier." He said nothing. "That is, the message made them stand down," I said. "The entire forward fleet. Voluntarily." He was looking out the window again. "Where were you?" I said, "in the 6 days before this happened?" It was the question I had been not asking for 4 hours. He had told me, when he left, that he was taking his personal courier to handle a communication matter. He had done that kind of thing before, small diplomatic exchanges that didn't require formal mission structure. I had not asked the details because I had never had reason to. "I was in Cathari space," he said. The words were measured, carefully given. "Alone?" "I had one person with me, my aide, Lucas." Lucas was 28 years old, quiet, unfailingly competent, and had been with Harrow for 4 years. He was also, I realize now, not currently in the palace. He had returned with Harrow, and then within a day, had quietly departed. I had not thought anything of it. "Where is Lucas now?" I asked. "Home," Harrow said. "I gave him leave. He'd earned it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the city lights were coming on, one by one, as the sun completed its setting sequence. "James," I said. He turned to look at me. "What did you do?" He held my gaze for a moment that felt very long. Then he said, "I had a conversation." "With whom?" "With the fleet commander, Grand Admiral Velek, of the Cathari 1st Forward Division." I knew the name. Everyone in the border region knew the name. Grand Admiral Velek was 60 years old, had commanded Cathari military operations for 23 years, and had expanded his empire's border encroachments with patient, methodical precision over his entire career. He was described in Sarathi intelligence files as one of the most stubborn and capable military minds in the current era. He did not receive unauthorized visitors. He certainly did not receive human visitors. He had never, in 23 years, stood any of his forces down for any reason that was not immediately, obviously, directly in his own strategic interest. "You went aboard a Cathari command ship," I said, "alone, without authorization, without escort, without any official mission status." "The ship's captain was very surprised to see me," Harrow said, mildly. "James, I had a letter of introduction from the Earth Compact's senior leadership," he said. "It got me to Valek's office. The rest was conversation." I stood up. I needed to move. I walked to the other side of the room and stood there, and then walked back. He watched me. "What conversation?" I said. "What did you say to a Cathari Grand Admiral that made him stand down 1,400 ships?" He looked at me, and there was something in his expression that I could not quite read. Not evasion, not dishonesty, but something that looked like protection. Like a person standing in front of something heavy, so that someone they cared about didn't have to hold it. I told him the truth, he said. "What truth?" "About what happens next," he said. "If they don't stop." The room felt different. It had an air to it now that I could not name precisely. Not fear, exactly. Something adjacent to it. The feeling of standing at the edge of a very large thing and understanding, for the first time, how large it actually is. "What is the truth about what happens next?" I said, very quietly. He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were that very ordinary human brown. Warm, patient, absolutely steady. "That's not something you need to carry," he said gently. "It's not information that makes your life better to have." I looked at him. I was the heir to the Sarathi imperial throne. I had top-level security clearance for everything my civilization knew. I had never, in my life, been told that information was something I did not need. "I am your wife," I said. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly why." There was a long silence between us. Outside, the city was fully lit now, orange and silver, and the cool blue of the administrative towers, the whole complicated landscape of a civilization that had been building itself for 4,000 years. I thought about what Claire had said at the wedding, 4 times. He read the account of the long patience 4 times before he ever walked through our door, moving in with seeds and care and time, and simply being more persistently present than the competing claim. I thought about his grandmother, 94 years old, playing cards, the most dangerous thing in any conflict. I thought about what he had said about strategic misdirection, the value of being underestimated, your opponent's strategy built on a false assumption about your capabilities. I thought about his aide Lucas, 28 years old, currently on leave, having earned it. I thought about 22 seconds between each ship going silent, tier by tier down the command hierarchy. A message relayed, something each level of command received, processed, and acted on before passing it down. A Grand Admiral who had not stood down a single ship in 23 years, who had read a letter from a human diplomat, and then apparently wept. I sat back down. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He turned his hand over and held mine. We sat there for a while without speaking. The city outside was fully lit and busy, indifferent to the fact that 1,400 warships had silently stood down 11 hours ago in a region of space, 3 days' travel away. "Is it over?" I finally asked. "The encroachment. Is it finished?" "Yes," he said quietly. "It's finished." "How can you be certain?" "Because the truth I told him was not negotiable," he said, "and because he understood it." I sat with that. "And the fleet?" "The ships are still there," he said. "Stationary. Standing down. They'll remain there. Valak will recommend to the Cathari leadership that the border engagement be formally suspended. The official reasoning will be a strategic reassessment. The actual reasoning," he stopped. "The actual reasoning is what you told him," I said. "Yes." I squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. I said, "Lucas." "What did Lucas do?" A brief pause. "Lucas handled the approach, the navigation, the docking request. He's very good at making things appear routine. He made a visit to a Cathari command ship in contested space appear routine. He did." I exhaled slowly. "He's 28 years old." "28 is not as young as it sounds," Harrow said. "He's been on this team since he was 24. He's handled things I would not have asked of most people twice his age." I thought about this. A 28-year-old human, navigating a small courier ship into Cathari contested space, past the sensor arrays of 1,400 warships, making it look like nothing worth worrying about, having, presumably, a thorough understanding of how to make things appear routine in very non-routine circumstances. "You trained him," I said. "I trained him," he confirmed. I thought about a civilization that produced James Harrow, and also trained people like him, and also, apparently, sent them quietly into places where 1,400 warships were maintaining a border dispute, with a letter, and a truth, that nobody wanted to say out loud. I thought about the Galactic Compact's assessment, proficient at uncertainty. I had thought I understood that phrase. I had been wrong about what it meant. What it meant was this: humans had developed, over millennia of difficult history, a specific kind of mind. A mind that did not need all the variables to be known before it could act effectively. A mind that could enter a room, or a command ship, where every variable was unknown and hostile and enormous, and operate at full capacity, and do it quietly, and come home, and sit by the window and drink tea and watch the city lights come on. That was not resilience. It was something more precise than resilience. It was a species that had become experts at impossible situations, not because they were the most powerful species, but because they had been doing impossible situations for so long that they had developed a curriculum for it. "The council is going to want an explanation," I said. "Yes," he said. "What will you tell them?" He thought for a moment. "That I engaged in private diplomacy on behalf of mutual interests, and that the outcome appears to have been a suspension of Cathari border operations. That the details of the diplomatic exchange are subject to the Earth Compact's confidentiality protocols. That I am available to discuss the strategic implications going forward." A pause. "That last part is genuinely true. I am available to discuss the strategic implications, at length, for as long as anyone wants to discuss them. You're going to give them a technically true answer that tells them nothing. I'm going to give them a practically useful answer," he said, with a slight correction in tone that was itself informative. "The details of what I said, and why it worked, are not things that improve in daylight. Some things are better managed by their outcomes than their methods." I looked at him for a long time. He looked back, patient, steady, those ordinary brown eyes that I had now spent well over a year looking at, and still sometimes found I was not quite seeing all the way through. "James," I said. "Yes. How many other situations have you handled like this, that I don't know about?" He was quiet for one moment, just one. "This is the largest," he said. It was not an answer to my question. It was a careful, precise, technically accurate non-answer that was itself an answer. I said, "I see." "Do you?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm beginning to," I said. "I think I'm still in the early part of beginning." He smiled. The real one. The one without any strategy behind it. The one that he kept for moments when he seemed to forget, briefly, to be anything other than exactly who he was. "That's fair," he said. We sat by the window until very late. The city lights slowly dimmed in the residential areas, the towers staying bright. Somewhere out there the emergency council was still working through its theories. Somewhere in deep space, 1,400 warships sat silent and still. I held his hand and thought about 22 seconds. About tiers of command. About a truth delivered quietly, through proper channels, tier by tier, until the entire structure of a military operation simply stood down. And I thought, I am still learning what I am married to, and I think the learning is going to take a very long time. That night, before sleep, I wrote in my private log a single line. I have kept the habit of private logs since I was 12 years old, and I have never once wished I had not. The line read, "He is the gentlest person I know. I am no longer certain that gentleness and power describe two different things in him. I think they may be the same thing. I do not yet fully understand this. I intend to." I closed the log. I lay in the dark and listened to his breathing, which was steady and calm, the breathing of someone who had done an enormous thing, and come home, and made tea, and was now simply asleep. Outside, the city finished its nighttime quiet. The stars were there, past the cloud layer. Somewhere among them, a border dispute had just ended. Nobody knew how. Almost nobody. I was beginning to. The survivor was found 17 days after the fleets went silent. A single Cathari scout shuttle, drifting without power in the outer edge of the Vareth Nebula, 3 days' travel from where the fleet had stood down. The Galactic Compact's search and recovery team found it on a routine scan, initially logging it as debris. Then one of the search team's technicians noticed a faint residual heat signature and realized the life support system was still barely functioning. There was one person inside, a Cathari officer, wearing Grand Admiral's insignia. She was alive. She was, in every measurable clinical sense, unhurt. She had adequate food and water supplies. The shuttle's medical systems reported no physical injury, no illness, no toxins. She had not spoken since she had sealed herself inside the shuttle. The life support logs showed she had been there for 16 days. She had not eaten for the last 11. Her name was Admiral Valak, the Grand Admiral herself, the same woman who had commanded the forward fleet for 23 years. The most stubborn and capable military mind in the current era, according to our intelligence files, the woman who had not stood down a ship in 2 decades. The rescue team brought her to the Galactic Compact's nearest medical station. They gave her food, water, rest. They treated her with standard care for her condition. They waited. She spoke on the third day. A medical officer who was present for it later filed a report that I read in full, 3 times, and then kept in the private section of my files that I had created specifically for things related to this matter. The medical officer had asked, gently, whether she remembered what had happened to the fleet, whether she could tell them anything about the events of the days preceding the stand-down. The admiral had looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she had said 4 sentences. He came aboard alone. He gave the fleet commander a letter. The fleet commander read it and ordered his own ships to stand down. I do not know what was in the letter, but I saw the fleet commander weep. Then she closed her eyes and did not speak again. Not that day. Not the next day, not, according to subsequent reports, at any point in the weeks that followed. The medical team tried. The Galactic Compact's intelligence officers tried. The Cathari government sent a representative, which produced the longest period of attempted communication, and then nothing. She had said what she was going to say. She had apparently decided that those 4 sentences were exactly the right number, and had organized her remaining silence around them with the precision of someone who had thought very carefully about how much to give, and had given exactly that. I read the report and thought about what it meant to see your fleet commander, 23 years of command, the person you had followed into border operations that spanned a career, reading a single letter and weeping. I thought about what information could be in a letter, what truth, as Harrow had put it, a truth that he had decided was better managed by its outcomes than its methods, a truth that a Cathari Grand Admiral, famous for stubbornness, had immediately and completely acted on. I sat with this for a long time, and I did not ask him about the letter. Not that day, not the week after, not the month after. I made this decision carefully. I made it not because I did not want to know, but because I had thought about what he had said. That's not something you need to carry. And I had begun to understand that the sentence was not condescension, and it was not evasion. It was a genuine act of protection. The protection of someone who carried a weight and had decided, with full awareness, not to pass it to the person they loved. I thought about his grandmother again. The most dangerous thing in any conflict is a person who appears harmless, said approvingly, by a woman playing cards at 94 who went peacefully to sleep after winning 4 hands in a row. I thought about a civilization that produced, in the same person, someone who would spend 8 days reading soil records out of genuine curiosity, and who would also, apparently, travel alone into contested space to deliver a letter that made a military commander weep and stand down 1,400 ships. Both things were true. Both things were the same person. I had been married to this person for 11 months, and I was still understanding what that meant. The Galactic Compact's intelligence investigation produced no official conclusions. The committee's report, which I received in my diplomatic capacity, stated that the disappearance of the forward fleet was the result of a voluntary stand-down initiated through internal Cathari command channels, that the triggering event remained unclear, and that no evidence of coercion, force, or external hostile action had been identified. The report noted the presence of an Earth Compact diplomatic courier in the general region during the relevant time frame, and indicated that inquiries had been made to the Earth Compact's diplomatic corps. The Earth Compact's response to those inquiries, which I also received in full, was 11 pages of courteous, detailed, thoroughly unhelpful information. It confirmed that James Harrow had been conducting informal diplomatic outreach in the region. It confirmed that this outreach was consistent with the Earth Compact's standard diplomatic practice of maintaining open communication channels with all parties in contested regions. It confirmed that the content of any private diplomatic communications was subject to confidentiality protocols. It provided a detailed explanation of those protocols, which were entirely sound and entirely standard, and left no practical avenue for the requesting parties to obtain the actual information they wanted. The response was signed by 6 senior members of the Earth Compact's diplomatic leadership. It was 11 pages long. It contained nothing. It was, I recognized immediately, exactly the kind of document you produced when you needed to demonstrate full cooperation while cooperating with nothing. It was, specifically, the kind of document you produced when the person who had written the original 11 pages was very good at this particular kind of writing. I found Harrow in our private library that evening. He was reading something about botany. He had developed an interest in Sarathi plant life in recent months, and had been working through our botanical archives with the same focused attention he brought to everything. I sat down across from him. He looked up. "The Compact's response to the Intelligence Committee," I said. "Yes," he said. 11 pages. "It needed to be thorough," he said, and there was the faintest trace of something in his voice. Not quite amusement, but adjacent. "Did you write it?" "I contributed to several sections." I looked at him. "It tells them nothing." "It tells them everything that is appropriate to share," he said carefully. "It is 11 pages of nothing. It is 11 pages of correct procedure," he said, and the trace of something in his voice was slightly more present now, which, in this context, happens to function similarly to nothing, but that's a consequence of procedure, not an intention of the document. I sat with this for a moment. "You are very good at this." "I've had a long time to practice," he said. "How long?" He thought about it. "Since I was about 25. That's when I started to understand that the most important thing in any communication isn't what you say. It's the architecture of what you say, the shape of the information, what you put in which position, what you let the other person infer, where you leave genuine silence, and where you fill it with correct but non-informative content." He paused. "My first supervisor called it structural honesty. Everything in the document is true. The document as a whole communicates nothing specific. Both things are simultaneously the case." "That is an extraordinary ability," I said. "It's a craft," he said. "Like any other. It takes practice. You get better at it." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "James, the investigation has officially closed with no conclusions. The Cathari fleet remains stood down. The border operations have formally suspended. What happens now?" He set his botany book on the table. He gave the question the serious attention it deserved. "Now the Cathari government spends some time working out what they believe happened and what they want to do about it," he said. "Their official position will be the strategic reassessment I mentioned. They'll maintain it because the alternative is explaining that their Grand Admiral stood down 1,400 ships in response to a conversation with a single human diplomat, which is a story with implications they'd prefer not to have become public knowledge. Because it makes them look vulnerable. Because it raises questions about what exactly the human said to produce that result," he said. "And neither they nor anyone else wants those questions asked too loudly." I understood. The silence around the event was not just Harrow's silence, or the Earth Compact's 11 pages of procedurally correct nothing. The Cathari themselves were invested in the silence. The Galactic Compact's Intelligence Committee had found it convenient to reach no conclusions. Admiral Valak had given 4 sentences and then stopped. Everyone involved had, for their own separate reasons, decided that the truth was better managed by its absence. This was, I realized, itself a form of extraordinary power. Not force, not threat. The ability to create a situation where every party with any stake in the matter independently concluded that silence was preferable to clarity, where the absence of explanation was everyone's best available option. I said, "And after the Cathari government works out what they believe happened, then what?" "Then I suspect we'll receive a formal diplomatic inquiry from the Cathari government," he said, "inquiring about improved relations and the possibility of a trade framework." I stared at him. "You turned an adversary into a potential partner." "I gave them a reason to want to be one," he said quietly. "That's different. The decision is entirely theirs." I stood up and walked to the window. The city outside, the towers, the lights. "James," I said, "I need to understand something. And I need you to be honest with me about the shape of the answer even if you can't tell me the content." He waited. "The truth you told Valak's fleet commander, is it something that applies only to the Cathari? Or is it something you could tell anyone?" A long silence. "Anyone who was in a comparable position," he said finally. "Meaning anyone who was in a position of escalating a conflict that humanity had decided needed to stop." Another silence. Shorter. "Yes," he said. I turned to look at him. He was sitting in the chair by the lamp, the botany book closed on his knee, his hands folded. He was looking at me, with the same steady, patient expression. But there was something else in it now. Something that recognized this moment for what it was. "How long has humanity known this?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. He was always careful about questions that deserved real answers. "We've known parts of it for a very long time," he said. "Different parts emerged at different points in our history. The full picture is relatively recent, within the last century or so." "And the Earth Compact's diplomatic corps," I said. "How many people like you are there?" "Like me?" "People who can walk onto a command ship alone and come back having produced the outcome you produced." He thought about this for a while. Then he said, "The capability isn't rare. The specifics of what I did aren't widely replicated. Most of my colleagues work in different ways, through different mechanisms, but the underlying orientation is fairly common in the Corps. The understanding that there are situations where very quiet, very precise action produces outcomes that no amount of force could achieve." I thought about this. The Earth Compact's diplomatic corps, an organization that, based on what I was now understanding, operated in the spaces between visible power, that moved through contested regions with small courier ships and letters and conversations, that produced outcomes that had no official explanation, and that everyone involved preferred to leave unexplained. 40 people, I would learn later. 40 humans, spread across the galaxy in the months following the Cathari incident, doing what Harrow had done in different forms and different contexts. Small, quiet, precisely targeted conversations, letters delivered to the right people at the right moments, truths told into rooms where they could not be unsaid. 3 ongoing interstellar conflicts would suspend operations within 1 year. Not through formal peace treaties, not through mediated settlements, not through any process that left a documentary record, through the specific, targeted application of exactly what Harrow had used on Grand Admiral Valak's command ship. But I did not know that yet, on that evening in our library. What I knew, standing by the window looking out at the city, was this. I had been married to someone for 11 months, and I had believed I was steadily learning what he was, what his capabilities were, what his civilization was. And I now understood that I had been looking at the visible portion of something much larger than I had perceived, that the gentleness and the attention, and the 8 days of soil records and the perfect recall of 31 names were all real, genuinely real, not performance, not cover, and that they also coexisted with a capacity that most of the galaxy would not be able to categorize if they saw it directly. I turned back from the window. "James," I said. "Yes. Are you safe to be married to?" He looked at me, and there was the expression I had catalogued, the genuinely open one, the one without strategy. "From you," he said. "Yes. Completely and absolutely yes." "From the rest of the galaxy?" "I work very hard," he said, "to make sure that question doesn't become relevant." I nodded slowly. I thought about that, about the work involved in keeping a situation from becoming a kind of situation where the question was relevant. "I believe you," I said. I sat back down. I picked up the botany book from where he had set it, and looked at the cover. Illustrated Flora of the Sarathi Northern Provinces. "Chapter 7? I said. He smiled. "Chapter 12, actually. The alpine varieties. Did you know that 3 of our most successful Earth restoration techniques came directly from studying how Sarathi alpine plants manage resource scarcity? Your northern flora figured out a solution we'd been looking for 60 years. I handed the book back to him. He opened it to the chapter. I got my own reading material from the shelf and sat back in my chair. The lamp between us was warm and steady. Outside, the city went about its complicated, ordinary life. A Grand Admiral sat silent in a medical ward somewhere. 1,400 ships sat still in contested space. 11 pages of correct procedure sat in a committee archive. And in a library in the Sarathi Imperial Palace, an heir to the 3 rings of governance, and a human diplomat with a botany book, sat reading across a lamp from each other, as though the evening were perfectly ordinary. In every way that I could demonstrate, it was. In every way I was beginning to understand, it was something else entirely. I turned my page. He turned his. We sat in the warm light and I thought, I am going to need to keep learning, for a very long time. That was, I decided, the exact right thing to need. Within 4 months of the Cathari fleet standing down, 7 civilizations had sent delegations to the Sarathi court. Not for us. Not primarily anyway. Not for the third phase trade discussions, or the agricultural restoration project, or any of the formal treaty mechanisms that were, technically, the reasons given in the official communication requests. They came because of him. None of them said this directly. Diplomatic communications did not work that way. The formal requests cited a range of purposes: trade alignment, cultural exchange frameworks, border security cooperation, scientific partnership opportunities. All legitimate, all partially true, all, in their own way, shaped around the same central fact that nobody was willing to state plainly in an official document. James Harrow had walked onto a Cathari command ship alone and come back having produced a result that no military force in the galaxy could have produced. Everyone knew this, because the absence of a credible alternative explanation was its own explanation, and every civilization that dealt with contested borders, unresolved disputes, or adversaries they could not outmatch militarily, was now sitting across from the same question: what exactly does the Earth Compact know? What exactly can they do with it? And is there a way to make that work for us instead of against us? He handled every single delegation himself, or rather, he sat at my side through the formal sessions, and then made himself available for the private conversations that, in diplomatic life, were where the real content lived. He was patient, warm, interested, and comprehensively uninformative about anything the other delegations actually wanted to know. The Varath Consortium returned, a new lead diplomat this time, not Tassari, but a more senior figure named Commissioner Orel, who had a reputation for cutting through diplomatic formality and asking the thing directly. She was tall for her species, very deliberate in movement, and she had a kind of focused stillness about her that I recognized, because I had learned to recognize it in Harrow. She was a person who had thought about the situation carefully before arriving and intended to say exactly what she meant. She said it in a private session on the second day, with only myself, Harrow, and Lord Devan present. She set her hands flat on the table and said, "The consortium would like to discuss a mechanism for collaborative conflict resolution, specifically, the kind your organization appears to have employed in the Cathari situation." Harrow looked at her with complete attentiveness. "The Earth Compact is always interested in collaborative conflict resolution," he said. "Can you tell me more about the specific situation you have in mind?" She held his gaze. "The border dispute with the Thar Collective. 15 years. No military resolution available to us. The standard mediation processes have been used and produced nothing." She paused. "We are interested in a different approach." "I understand," he said. "Walk me through the history of the dispute." For the next 4 hours, Commissioner Orel walked him through it. Harrow listened. He asked questions. He took no notes. He never took notes in sessions, which I had initially found unusual, and had come to understand was because he didn't need to. Every detail went in and stayed there. He asked about the origins of the dispute, the key points of escalation, the moments when resolution had seemed possible, and why each had failed, the specific concerns on both sides that previous mediators had not addressed. At the end of the 4 hours, he said, "I would like to review your documentation on the dispute before making any assessment. If you can provide the full record, we can reconvene in 2 days." She provided it, all of it, 200 years of border dispute records, in 6 volumes of compressed documentation. He read all 6 volumes in 1 day. I know because I asked his aide Claire, who had arrived a month prior to assist with the increasing delegation load, and she told me, with an expression that suggested she found this perfectly normal, that he had started at the 7th hour of the morning and finished at the 23rd. On the second day, he came back to the table and told Commissioner Orel, in specific and detailed terms, what he believed the core unresolved issue was. Not the border demarcation, not the resource rights. Those were the visible arguments. The actual underlying issue, based on what he had read, was a question of recognition. Whether the Thar Collective's expanded territorial claims, which had begun 200 years ago as a survival migration, had produced an identity for the Thar people that required the consortium's formal acknowledgement to be stable. He said this calmly and clearly, and with reference to specific events in the historical record. Commissioner Orel sat very still for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was slightly different from the one she had been using, "That is the first time I have heard anyone say that, in 15 years of discussions." "It's in the record," he said. Several of the failed mediation sessions came very close to it, then redirected. I think the mediators recognized the shape of it, but were concerned about introducing an identity argument into what was being framed as a resource dispute. Because identity arguments are harder to compromise on, she said. They're impossible to compromise on, he said. You can't compromise on who you are, but you can acknowledge who someone is, without losing anything. Acknowledgement isn't concession. She looked at him for a long moment. You're saying the consortium needs to formally recognize the Thar migration as a founding event, rather than a border incursion. I'm saying that based on the record. That recognition is the thing that unlocks everything else, he said. The resource boundaries can be renegotiated after that. They're secondary. They've been presented as primary, because the primary issue felt too philosophical to put in a treaty document. He paused. Then he said, treaties can be philosophical. They sometimes need to be. The most durable ones usually are. She was quiet for quite a long time. Then she said, can you help us formulate the language? Yes, he said. That's something I'm happy to do. He and Commissioner Orell spent the next 6 days formulating language. I sat in on parts of it. It was, genuinely, one of the most impressive things I had watched him do, and I had watched him do a considerable number of impressive things. The ability to take a 200-year dispute and locate the specific, precise language that acknowledged what needed acknowledging without triggering the defensive responses that had defeated every previous attempt, to find the words that were philosophically complete and politically workable simultaneously, to test each formulation against the historical record and adjust until it was right. It was a craft. The same craft he had described to me once as structural honesty, building a shape that held what it needed to hold and left out what it needed to leave out. The consortium delegation left with a draft framework. 14 months later, the consortium and the Thar Collective signed a formal recognition agreement that ended the border dispute. The agreement cited, in its preamble, the foundational importance of acknowledging the Thar migration as a defining moment in the Thar people's development. The language was word for word what Harrow had drafted in those 6 days. He was not at the signing ceremony. He sent a short congratulatory message through the Earth Compact's official channels. Then he went back to his botany reading. This was the pattern. 7 delegations in 4 months, and then more after that. A steady stream of civilizations with complicated problems that standard mechanisms had failed to resolve. He worked through them methodically, thoroughly, with the same focused attention he brought to soil records and sealing mathematics. Some he could help with quickly, a reframe, a piece of historical analysis, a language formulation. Some required weeks of document review. Some he assessed and determined were not ready yet. The parties hadn't exhausted their alternatives enough, hadn't arrived at the point where a conversation like the one he could offer would land correctly. He was, I realized, managing a workload that would have required a department. He was doing it with Claire's assistance and occasional support from Lucas when Lucas was available, which was less and less frequently, as the Earth Compact began assigning Lucas to work of his own. I watched all of this and thought about what it meant. The Earth Compact had sent 40 people, 40 humans, distributed across the galaxy in the 12 months following the Cathari incident. I knew this because the information was in the diplomatic traffic that passed through the Sarathi court, and because I had started paying careful attention to Earth Compact movements in a way I had not needed to before. 40 people, no warships accompanying them, no military escort, no announced mission objective. They described themselves in the official documentation as a cultural and diplomatic outreach expansion, which was technically accurate in the way that the 11-page response to the Intelligence Committee had been technically accurate. 3 interstellar conflicts suspended operations in the year following the Cathari incident. Not simultaneously, not through any visible connection. One in the Verath outer systems, one in the disputed territories near the Galactic Compact's southern boundary, one in a region that had been in low-level conflict for so long that most galactic maps simply labeled it contested and didn't bother with more specificity. All 3 simply stopped, not through formal peace agreements, not through mediated settlements, not through anything that left a documentary record that anyone could point to, through conversations, through letters, through exactly what Harrow had described, very quiet, very precise action producing outcomes that no amount of force could achieve. I thought about something I had read once in a Sarathi historical text about the period before the unification, about the various factions that had competed for dominance in the 4 centuries prior. The historian had written that the faction that ultimately produced the Sarathi dominion had won not through military superiority or economic power, but through what they called deep positioning, the ability to be the necessary party in every situation, to make themselves genuinely useful to enough different interests simultaneously that by the time their rivals understood what had happened, the network was already complete. Deep positioning, the ability to be the necessary party in every situation. I thought about a civilization that had spent 400 years as a minor, young, slightly chaotic addition to galactic civilization, that had been described in briefings and assessments as resilient and adaptable, and slightly unpredictable, that had sent delegations and established trade frameworks, and been received as an interesting but not yet significant partner by most of the major powers. And that had, in the meantime, been developing something, a specific, targeted, extraordinarily precise capability that had nothing to do with warships or economic leverage, that operated in the space between all the things that other civilizations used as power, and that did not require visibility to function. That, in fact, functioned better without visibility. I thought about the Galactic Compact's phrase, proficient at uncertainty. I thought about the most dangerous thing in any conflict is a person who appears harmless. I thought about deep positioning. I sat with all of this for several weeks. I went about my duties. I attended council sessions. I managed the flow of incoming delegations with the efficiency that came from having done it long enough to make it automatic. I sat beside my husband in formal settings and worked alongside him in private ones, and watched, always watched, the way he operated, the attention he paid, the choices he made about what to say and what not to say, what to offer and what to decline, where to press and where to step back. He brought the same quality of attention to everything. The delegations and the botany reading and the conversations over dinner, and the evenings when he helped our household staff with small problems that were not his responsibility, but that he noticed and addressed because the opportunity was there. He cooked for people when they were working late. He remembered birthdays. He fixed things that were broken. He spent an entire afternoon once helping one of the palace's younger archivists locate a document that the archival system had miscatalogued, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had noticed her spending 3 days looking distressed and had asked what the problem was. She found the document. She was so grateful she nearly cried. He told her she had excellent instincts for archival organization and should consider proposing an improved cataloging protocol to her supervisor, because the error she had encountered indicated a systematic flaw that would affect others too. She did propose the protocol. Her supervisor accepted it. It was implemented within the month. He had noticed a junior archivist's distress, identified the problem, solved it, and turned it into a structural improvement that benefited the entire palace archive system. In an afternoon, in passing. I thought about 40 humans spread across the galaxy. I thought about how many other archivists they might be helping, how many small, precise, structural improvements might be occurring in how many different systems, in how many different civilizations, at how many different levels. I thought about deep positioning. I thought about seeds and care and time, about outlasting competing claims not through force but through consistent, genuine, persistent presence. One evening, about 6 months after the delegations had begun, I asked him directly. We were in the working rooms after a long day, and I said, "James, what is the Earth Compact's long-term objective?" He looked up from his papers. He considered the question. "The same as anyone's," he said. "To build something that lasts." "For whom?" "For everyone," he said, and he said it without any weight, without any grandeur, as though it were the most obvious and simple statement. The species that last are the ones that create conditions where everyone around them can also last. History is pretty clear on this. Empires, built on extraction, collapse. If networks built on mutual benefit persist, we've had a long time to study the examples. I looked at him, and the 40 people currently deployed across the galaxy. He glanced at me, a slight acknowledgement that I had the number right. Are building mutual benefit, he said simply. By having conversations and delivering letters. Primarily, yes. Conversations that end wars. Conversations that give the parties in conflicts the specific thing they were missing. he said. Sometimes that's information. Sometimes it's a reframe. Sometimes it's just someone willing to say clearly what nobody else was willing to say clearly, because they were too close to it. He paused. You'd be surprised how often the missing piece is just someone willing to say the obvious thing that everyone was pretending not to see. I thought about the Thar Collective, about acknowledgement versus concession, about the obvious thing that every mediator had come close to and then redirected away from. And what happens, I said carefully, when conversations aren't enough? He held my gaze. Then we have other conversations, he said, like the one with Grand Admiral Valek's fleet commander, like the letter, like the truth that a Cathari officer in a medical ward had described as something that had made a 23-year military veteran weep and stand down 1,400 ships. I nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? He said, and again, it was not quite a question. More than I did a year ago, I said, less than I'll understand in another year. He smiled. The real one. That's exactly the right answer, he said. Outside the window, the city was lit against the dark sky, and above the clouds, though we could not see them, the stars were full of quiet, small ships, carrying humans, with letters and conversations, and an extremely long view of what they were building. I thought about how a civilization begins a project that its founders know they will not live to see completed, about the particular kind of confidence involved in planting seeds for a harvest you understand will come long after you are gone. Forward trust. Building for whoever came after, with the confidence that they would be intelligent enough to receive it correctly. I had thought that concept was Sarathi. I was increasingly convinced it was also very deeply, very fundamentally human, just applied to a scale that made my ancestors' architecture look modest. I reached across the table and took his hand. He looked at it, then at me. Are you all right? He said. Yes, I said. I'm very all right, I'm just thinking. About what? I considered how to say it. I said, about how long it takes to understand something that you thought you already understood. He looked at me steadily. There was warmth in it, and recognition, and the specific kind of patience that came from someone who had spent a long time being understood incorrectly, and had decided not to rush the process for anyone. Take as long as you need, he said. I held his hand and thought, I will. I intend to, and I think this is the project of a lifetime, and I think I am content with that. I squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. Outside, the city hummed its ordinary, complicated life. Somewhere across the galaxy, 3 former war zones were quiet, and 40 humans were having very careful conversations, one at a time, one by one, in the specific direction of something that would last. My daughter asked me about her father on a morning in early spring, 7 years after I had watched 1,400 ships go silent and begun the long process of understanding what that meant. She was 8 years old. She had his eyes, that very ordinary human brown that I had spent years looking at and never quite looking through, and my people's composure, the particular stillness that Sarathi children develop early and carry for life. She was already learning her 6th language. She asked questions the way he did, with patient, real curiosity, waiting for the actual answer rather than the short one. She had been sitting with me at breakfast, watching through the window as a Cathari diplomatic transport descended through the morning clouds toward the palace landing area. The Cathari had sent delegations 3 times in the past year. Their requests were formal, courteous, extensive in their documentation, and substantially concerned with trade development in the border regions that their fleet had been occupying 7 years ago and had not occupied since. My daughter watched the transport and said, without preamble, "The Cathari bow very deep when father comes in. Why do they bow deeper for him than for grandfather?" She was 8. She had already noticed this. I should not have been surprised. She noticed things the way he noticed things. I set down my morning drink. I looked at her. She was looking back at me with that patient, real curiosity, and I thought about how to answer a question like this honestly, to a child who deserved honesty, about a father she adored, and who adored her with the complete, unguarded quality that he kept for the people he had decided were entirely his to love. I said, "Do you know what grandfather does?" "He governs," she said. "He makes decisions for the whole dominion. He has to balance a lot of different things." "And do you know what father does?" She thought about it. "He talks to people," she said. He reads a lot of things, and then he talks to people. That's correct, I said. Do you know why the talking works? She shook her head. I said, your father comes from a species that has been through a very long history. Much longer, in terms of what they've experienced, than most other civilizations. They've had great achievements and very difficult times, and they've made serious mistakes and learned from them, and they've survived things that should have ended them, and they've come out the other side of all of it, still here, and still trying. She was listening with her full attention. She always listened with her full attention, which was, I sometimes thought, one of the purest things she had inherited from him. Over all of that time, I said, they developed a very specific kind of understanding about how conflicts start and how they end, about what people are really afraid of underneath the things they say they're afraid of, about what it costs to keep a fight going and what it costs to stop, about the specific things that make someone willing to stand down, to step back, to choose a different direction than the one they were committed to. I paused. Your father knows those things. He knows them the way other people know things they've studied all their lives. And when he talks to people, even very powerful people, even people who have made up their minds, he knows exactly what to say. She was quiet for a moment. What does he say? She asked. I don't know, I said. I've never asked, and he's never told me. But whatever it is, it's true. It's always the truth. And the truth is something that, once you've heard it, you can't go back from. You can't unknow it. So the people he talks to, they hear what they need to hear, and after that, they make different choices. She looked out the window at the transport. The Cathari delegation was disembarking. Their formal robes caught the morning light. Like the fleets, she said. I looked at her. She was 8 years old. She had heard, without anyone intending her to hear it, enough to form the outline. Children always heard more than you meant them to. Yes, I said carefully, like the fleets. She thought about this for a while. Then she said, is that why the Cathari bow deep? Because they know he could talk to them again? I sat with her question for a long moment. It was, I realized, exactly the right question. Not asked with fear, not asked with judgment, just the child's direct perception of a dynamic that she had observed and was trying to understand correctly. I think, I said slowly, it's more complicated than that. I think they bow deep because they respect him, and respect is different from fear, even when both come from understanding how capable someone is. Fear makes you want to stay away from someone. Respect makes you want to be in their good graces. The Cathari are smart enough to know there's a difference. She considered this with the seriousness she gave most things. Then she said, is father in a good mood today? I laughed. It surprised me slightly, the way laughter sometimes did when it came from a completely unexpected angle. She looked at me, not quite sure what was funny, but beginning to smile because I was smiling. I believe so, I said. He found a new species of alpine plant in the North Wing Conservatory this morning that he is very excited about. She made a satisfied nod, the kind that means good, that's settled, and went back to her breakfast. He came in 20 minutes later. He had the slight extra energy he always had when he was genuinely interested in something, a kind of focused brightness. He said good morning to both of us, asked our daughter about the word composition exercise she had been working on in her 5th language, listened to her explanation with his complete attention, asked one question that made her think for a moment, and then answer with a better understanding than she'd started with, and then sat down with his own morning meal. He was in the middle of telling me about the plant, a variety that cross-referenced with a chapter in the botany book he had been reading for 3 years, and that connected to a soil pattern in the Sarath Kalan restoration zone. Everything was always connected in his mind. A conversation about a plant would eventually loop back to soil science, and from there to pre-unification records, and from there to something about architectural mathematics, and he would arrive back at the starting point, from an angle neither of us had seen coming, and our daughter looked up from her meal and said, without particular preparation, Father, why do you always tell the truth? He stopped. He looked at her, a genuine pause. Because lies are complicated, he said. Every lie needs 3 more lies to support it. The truth stays the same every time you tell it. It's much less work. She thought about this. But sometimes the truth is hard to say. Yes, he said. So why say it anyway? He set down his cup. He gave the question the serious attention he gave all genuine questions from all genuine people, regardless of their age or status, or how convenient the question was. Because the hard things are the ones that matter most, he said. The easy truth doesn't need you. Anyone can say the easy thing. The hard truth, the one that's uncomfortable, the one that changes something, that's the one that only works if someone's willing to actually say it. And if you don't say it, it just sits there, unspoken, making everything worse. Problems that could have been resolved staying unresolved. Conflicts that could have ended, continuing. He paused. Saying the hard truth is a form of respect. For the person you're saying it to. It's telling them, I think you're strong enough and wise enough to hear this and do something useful with it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, even if it makes them sad. Especially then, he said gently. Sadness from truth is clean. It hurts, and then it passes, and you know something real. Sadness from not knowing is the kind that never quite goes away. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded, with the gravity of an 8-year-old who has filed something important. She went to her lessons. He went to review the morning's diplomatic traffic. I stayed at the breakfast table and sat with everything he had just said, the way I had learned to sit with things he said, not letting them pass by as ordinary words but actually holding them, turning them over, finding the full weight. Sadness from truth is clean. Sadness from not knowing is the kind that never quite goes away. I thought about Admiral Valek's fleet commander, about a man who had read a letter and wept, about what kind of truth, delivered by a human in a plain letter, had the weight to produce that response, in a 23-year career military officer who had never stood a ship down. I thought about the truth about what happens next, which Harrow had described to me once, and which I had never pressed for specifics on, which I still had not pressed for, which I had decided, years ago, was not something I needed to carry, and which I had come to understand was not evasion, but its own form of love. Sadness from not knowing is the kind that never quite goes away. He carried it so I didn't have to. I sat with that for a long time, the specific, precise weight of what that meant, not just for me, for the people he talked to, one by one, in rooms across the galaxy. The people who heard the hard truth and were then, if they were capable of it, changed by it. The ones who weren't changed, who heard it and couldn't hold it, couldn't let it produce a different choice. I thought about those too. I had never asked what happened to them. I had made a decision, years ago, not to know. And I had made a decision, years ago, to trust that the person who knew was a person worth trusting. That afternoon, his aide Claire found me in the working rooms and asked if she could have a few minutes. She had been working alongside us for 3 years now, and she had the quality that all of his closest people had. This particular blend of precise competence and genuine warmth that I had come to think of as a kind of hallmark, as if whoever trained them, or whoever selected them, or whoever the Earth Compact's core produced, they all had this same underlying orientation. Attentive, careful, calm under pressure, and underneath all of it, deeply, genuinely invested in the outcome being good. She sat down across from me and said, I wanted to let you know that James has been nominated for the Galactic Compact's Conflict Resolution Commission. The appointment would be a significant role. It would mean periods of travel. She paused. I thought you should hear it from someone who cares about both of you, rather than through the official channels. I looked at her. He knows about this? He was informed this morning, she said. He hasn't told you yet, because he was waiting for the right moment. What is the right moment for something like this? I said. She smiled slightly. He'll find it. He always does. I thought about this. A formal appointment to the Galactic Compact's Conflict Resolution Commission. A role with legitimacy, with visibility, with official standing. No longer the quiet, deniable, technically routine diplomatic outreach of the past several years. A public position. I said, is this a change in approach? The Earth Compact moving from quiet to visible? Claire considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. It's a recognition, she said, that the quiet phase accomplished what it needed to accomplish. The network is established. The understanding exists in enough places. Moving to a more visible role now doesn't expose what was built quietly. It just gives it a legitimate superstructure. She paused. James would say this more precisely, but that's the gist of it. Deep positioning, I thought. Building the network first. Then, when the network was complete, stepping into the visible structure with a foundation already in place. Will he take the appointment? I said. What do you think? She said. I thought about it. About a man who had spent his career being precisely as visible as was useful, and no more. About the particular quality of someone who understood, at every moment, exactly which phase of a situation they were in. If the quiet phase was done, if the foundation existed, if the next phase required a different kind of presence. Yes, I said. He'll take it. She nodded. She stood to go, and then she paused at the door. She said, for what it's worth, I've known him for 26 years. I've watched him in a lot of situations. I've never seen him as complete as he's been these past 7 years. She looked at me steadily. Whatever you think is happening in one direction, something is also happening in the other. That matters, to him and to the work. She left. I sat with that too. He told me about the appointment over dinner. Our daughter was there, and he waited until after she had gone to her room, not because the information was inappropriate for her, but because, as I had come to understand, he calibrated everything. The right thing at the right time to the right person, always. He said, I was offered an appointment to the Galactic Compact's Conflict Resolution Commission. I'd like to discuss it with you before I accept. I said, I've already discussed it with Claire. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Of course you have. She was right to tell me. I prefer information from people who care about the outcome, over information from official channels. He smiled. I taught her that. I know, I said. You taught her a lot of things. She's been teaching me some of them for 3 years. He looked at me, really looked, the way he sometimes did when something had surprised him pleasantly. Is that right? He said. I have been paying attention, I said. For 7 years, I am much better at paying attention than I was when you first noticed a ceiling. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I should tell you, the appointment will involve travel, not the same kind as the past years, more structured, more visible, but more demanding in some ways. I know, I said. You'll manage the court during the longer absences. I have been managing the court, I said. I was managing it before I met you. I'll continue to manage it. He nodded. Then he said, there's something else I should tell you. I waited. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Plain white, sealed, his handwriting on the front. No official insignia, no Earth Compact seal, no formal address. Just a name, a Cathari name I recognized as the fleet commander's, and below it, a single word in Sarathi. The word was, whenever. He held it between his fingers and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. This is what I brought to the command ship, he said. I want you to know it exists. I've never shown it to anyone. I don't think I need to show it to you either. But I want you to know it's real. And I want you to know where I keep it, in case there is ever a reason for you to need to know. I looked at the envelope. I looked at his face. He was steady, patient, entirely present, and there was something in his expression that I had not seen before, a kind of deliberate openness that he had chosen, consciously, as a gift. He was not offering me the contents. He was offering me the knowledge of its existence. He was saying, I cannot give you everything, but I will not hide everything either. There is a line, and you are on the right side of it. I said, where do you keep it? Inside cover of the botany book, he said. Volume 12. I nodded slowly. He put the envelope back in his jacket. He looked at me. Whenever, I said quietly. That's what the word on the envelope means. Yes, he said. I thought about what it meant to write a letter addressed to a fleet commander with the word, whenever. Whenever you are ready to remember what I told you. Whenever the weight of knowing becomes useful, rather than simply heavy. Whenever you need to be reminded. A truth that you could carry forward. That would still be true later. James, I said. Yes. What is it like, knowing what you know? He was quiet for a long time. The table between us. The dinner going cool. The lamp on. The city outside. It's like having a very large map, he said at last, of something that most people only ever see part of. You can see further. You can see where things are going before they get there. You can position better, respond better, choose better. A pause. But you can also see things that are hard to see. Consequences, costs, the things that have to happen if certain choices don't get made. You carry those too. They don't go away just because the situation resolves. He looked at me. That's why I didn't want you to carry it, he said. Not because you're not strong enough. You're the strongest person I know. Because it's not necessary for you to carry it. I can carry it. So you don't have to. I thought about what our daughter had asked. Why do you always tell the truth? And what he had said. The hard truth is a form of respect. Telling someone you think they're strong enough and wise enough to hear it. And I thought about what it meant that he had chosen, for me, not to tell. That the protection was also a form of respect. The kind that said, I don't need you to carry this with me. I have it. You have other things. Both of these are true. Be kind first, I said. That's what you told her this morning. He looked at me. After breakfast, I said. After her lessons. She came to find you in the North Wing Conservatory. You were looking at the plant. She asked you what the most important thing was. And you told her, be kind first. That's the whole secret. He was quiet. She believed you, I said, completely. Good, he said softly. So do I said. I also know it isn't the whole secret. I know there are other parts that make the kindness possible, the capability behind it, the understanding behind it, the long history and the hard learning and the things you carry so other people don't have to. He held my gaze. But I think, I said, that you are also right. That the kindness is the most important part, not because it's all there is, but because it's the part that decides what all the rest gets used for. He was still for a long time. Then he said, yes, that's exactly it. Your grandmother knew this too, I said. She did, he said. Better than anyone I've known. I reached across the table. He took my hand. We sat there in the quiet of the evening, in the palace that his people had studied for months before he ever set foot in it, in the room that looked out over the city his children would grow up in, under the sky that both our civilizations shared whether they always acknowledged it or not. And I thought about our daughter, who had his eyes and my composure, and both of our habits of attention, and who was learning her sixth language, and asking the right questions, and who had nodded with the gravity of a child who has filed something important, when he said the hard truth is a form of respect. I thought, she is going to be extraordinary. I thought, whatever she becomes, she will have learned that kindness and capability are not opposites, that gentleness is not the absence of power, that the people who are truly safe to love are the ones who are fully capable and fully choose, with their whole awareness, not to make that your problem. I held his hand in the lamplight and thought about the fossil in my pocket, which I still carried, which I had carried for 7 years, the perfect spiral from a creature that had survived by recognizing change before anyone else noticed the conditions were different. I thought about ceilings and soil records and a 22-second interval between each ship going silent, tier by tier down the command hierarchy. I thought about an envelope in the cover of a botany book with a word on the front that meant, not now but not never, just waiting for the right moment, whenever that was. I thought about a long, quiet, patient project, built over decades and centuries, seeds and care and time, forward trust, building for people not yet born with the confidence they would be intelligent enough to receive what you left them. He was looking at the window, to city outside, the lights reflecting off the low clouds. What are you thinking about? I asked. Chapter 12, he said. The alpine varieties. There's a pollination pattern I want to check against the restoration zone data in the morning. I laughed and he smiled, and outside the lights of the civilization we were both, in our different ways, responsible for, continued their ordinary, complicated, ongoing effort to exist and persist and build something worth the building. He was the gentlest person I knew. He was also the reason 3 empires slept carefully. Both of these things were completely true, and I had made my peace with both. I squeezed his hand. He squeezed mine. We sat there until the lights of the city went soft with late evening, and then we went to check on our daughter, who was asleep with a language study guide still open on her pillow, and the expression of someone who had asked all her questions for the day, and was satisfied with the answers. He marked her page and set the guide on the table beside her. We went to bed. The envelope was in the botany book, where it would stay until it was needed. The spiral fossil was on my bedside table, where it had been for 7 years. The city was quiet outside. The stars were there, past the clouds, doing what they always did, indifferent and eternal, and full of small ships, moving quietly from one careful conversation to the next. The galaxy was not the same as it had been 7 years ago. It was better in ways that had no official documentation, no treaty record, no ceremony. It was better in the quiet, unmeasurable way that things get better when enough of the right conversations happen in the right places, at the right moments. He had done some of that. 40 other people had done more. The work was ongoing. It would be ongoing for a very long time. I fell asleep thinking about Chapter 12, the alpine varieties, the pollination pattern, and how everything was always connected in his mind, and how that was perhaps the most human thing of all, the insistence that if you looked carefully enough at anything, you would find that it connected to everything else, and that every connection was an opportunity to understand something better than you had before. I was still learning. I would be learning for the rest of my life. That was, I had decided, the exact right thing to be doing.